What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about the greatest hero of the Islamic world, Saladin, the man who crushed the Crusaders at Hattin and reclaimed Jerusalem, actually doesn't belong to him? We are accustomed to seeing him as a self-sufficient genius, but this is history's greatest illusion. The true architect of this triumph was his teacher, a man the world has almost forgotten. The role of the gatherer of lands, the one who forged a state capable of challenging the Franks, was played by Nur ad-Din Zengi. It was he who united a fractured Syria, subjugated warring emirs, and, most importantly, laid the foundation for the seizure of Egypt. He remained the shadow from which a legend stepped into eternity. He created the very conditions that made Saladin's triumph inevitable. Today, you will learn the true, psychologically complex story of Nur ad-Din Zengi, the man who forged the sword for his student. In this episode, we will break down how the son of a murdered ruler, starting with a single border city, swore an oath to unite the entire Middle East. Why his greatest weapons were not the swords of legions, but justice and ideological propaganda. What fatal decision, at least at first glance, allowed his student Saladin to surpass him and claim all the glory? And how his own unforeseen death became the greatest gift for the one he raised. This is a tragedy of teacher and student, a story about loyalty, ambition, and how the death of one man became the birth of another. The world remembers the one who took Jerusalem, but greatness always belongs to the one who made that capture possible. This is not just a biography. This is an autopsy of the true reasons behind the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which should have stood for another 100 years. And this story teaches us a lesson in 2025 about the nature of power. It is not inherited, it is conquered. The year is 1146. The Middle East seemed to have found its master, Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Lion of Syria. He entered history as a ruthless and cunning commander who united Mosul and Aleppo with fire and sword. 2 years prior, in 1144, he achieved the impossible by taking Edessa, the capital of the oldest Crusader state. This blow was so devastating that the Pope was forced to declare the Second Crusade. Zengi stood at the absolute pinnacle, firmly convinced that his dynasty would rule for centuries. The commander had no doubt the main threat would come from the west with the armies of European kings. But in reality, catastrophe was not waiting for him on the battlefield. Death was stalking him in his own tent. In September 1146, during the siege of yet another fortress, Imad ad-Din Zengi fell at the hand of one of his own slaves, according to legend, over a dispute over spilled wine. The man whom the armies of kings could not stop died from the dagger of a servant, and the empire, held together exclusively by his personal terror, collapsed that very same night. The world exploded. Crusaders in Antioch and Jerusalem celebrated, while the emirs of Damascus breathed a sigh of relief. The threat of Islamic unification, it seemed, had passed. Zengi's state immediately fractured. The eldest son, Saif ad-Din Ghazi, received the grand prize, rich and stable Mosul in Iraq, complete with an army, a treasury, and security. The second son, 28-year-old Nur ad-Din, received almost nothing, except Aleppo, a dangerous border city sandwiched between Frankish Antioch, Edessa, and a hostile Damascus. Nur ad-Din entered the citadel possessing neither his father's army nor his treasury. Enemies were already moving troops toward his borders. Jocelyn II, the former Count of Edessa, decided the perfect moment had arrived to reclaim what was lost. Everyone expected the young and inexperienced ruler of Aleppo to be crushed within a few months. But his enemies failed to account for one thing. If Zengi ruled as a warrior who inspired fear, Nur ad-Din revealed himself as an ideologue who relied on faith. His first action was not an attempt to negotiate an inheritance. Upon learning that Jocelyn II was attempting to retake Edessa, Nur ad-Din immediately races north and inflicts a crushing defeat on the Crusaders. Then he makes a brutal but strategically flawless decision. He orders the destruction of its fortifications and expels the Christian population, burning this bleeding wound off his map entirely. He sends a signal: there will be no rematch. However, his primary instrument does not become the sword. His greatest weapon is justice. Nur ad-Din was an ascetic. He demonstratively abolished unjust taxes, built madrasas, hospitals, and courts. While other emirs drowned in luxury, he wore simple clothes and prayed. Behind this lay not just piety, but the most effective propaganda of the 12th century. Zengi fought for land. Nur ad-Din turned the war into Jihad, a sacred duty. He gave his warriors not just loot, but a higher purpose. He became al-Malik al-Adil, the just king. And it is precisely this, how to turn an army of mercenaries into an army of fanatics who believe in their righteousness, that a young Kurdish officer named Salah ad-Din would learn from him. Nur ad-Din secured his foothold in Aleppo, having retaken Edessa and won the hearts of the common people with his reputation as the just king. But his state looked incomplete, resembling a head without a body. Aleppo was a fortress, but not a capital. The grand prize, the pearl of Syria, the richest and most ancient city, Damascus, remained independent. For 8 years, Damascus had desperately maneuvered between Zengi's empire and the kingdom of Jerusalem. And now the rulers of Damascus, the Burid dynasty, made a fatal decision, for they feared the ambitions of Nur ad-Din, this fanatical just king from Aleppo, far more than they feared the Franks. They concluded a military alliance with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Nur ad-Din realized a terrible truth he would have to accept, that to unite Syria for a holy war against the Christians, he would first have to declare war on Muslims who were allies of those Christians. He had to transform into a conqueror in order to become a unifier. Nur ad-Din was presented with the greatest paradox of his life. He, the just king, the ideologue of Jihad, had to launch a war against the main Muslim city of Syria, Damascus, which had allied itself with the Franks. He did not rush into a suicidal attack. Nur ad-Din proved himself a master of the long game. He knew that the rulers of Damascus feared him, but the people respected his justice. He began a multi-year propaganda war. His agents in Damascus spoke of his asceticism. His scholars in Aleppo preached about the shame of allying with infidels. He simply waited for Damascus to make a mistake on its own. And Damascus stumbled. Or rather, the enemy made the mistake. In 1148, the Second Crusade, led by European kings, decided to attack Damascus, a city that was their ally. This move was a colossal strategic stupidity on the part of the Crusaders, one that left a deep scar. The city fought them off, but the betrayal by the Franks convinced the people of Damascus one cannot rely on the infidels. They looked increasingly to the north, toward Aleppo. For 6 years, Nur ad-Din waited for this moment. For 6 years, he consolidated his power, while Damascus grew weaker from internal intrigues and fear. By 1154, the city's ruler, Mujir ad-Din, who was paying tribute to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had become extremely unpopular. Upon receiving a message from his supporters inside the walls, Nur ad-Din immediately moved his army. But instead of a classic siege, he launched a special operation. He did not storm the walls. He set up camp and began negotiations, simultaneously activating his fifth column inside the city. His soldiers, under strict orders, behaved impeccably, demonstrating the discipline of the just king. On April 25, 1154, while negotiations were ongoing, his supporters opened the gates. Nur ad-Din's soldiers entered Damascus with practically no fighting. The citizens, tired of the weakness and shame of the Frankish alliance, welcomed him as a liberator. Nur ad-Din rode into the city not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler. He forbade looting and immediately abolished the shameful tribute to Jerusalem. Let us assess the scale of what happened. For the first time since the early caliphate, the two great centers of Syria, Aleppo and Damascus, were united under the authority of one man. Previously, the Crusaders survived by playing on the contradictions between Muslim emirs according to the principle of divide and conquer. Nur ad-Din destroyed this possibility. It is as if in medieval Europe, Paris and London suddenly united against a common enemy, trapping him in a narrow coastal strip. It was in Damascus, having moved his capital there, that Nur ad-Din began to build his empire. He minted coins and built his famous hospital, the Maristan, which amazed Europeans with its level of medicine. And it is here, in his inner circle, that we first notice two Kurds, the brave but somewhat rough commander, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, and his quiet, intelligent, unnoticed nephew, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom we know as Saladin. Nur ad-Din established himself as the undisputed master of Syria. His state stretched from Mosul to the borders of Jerusalem. For the first time in half a century, the Crusaders shifted from offense to deep defense. But while Nur ad-Din was gathering Syria, a catastrophe was brewing in the south that could cancel out all his achievements. All eyes turned to Egypt. The richest land in the world, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, was ruled by the weak Fatimid dynasty. The caliph served as a puppet, while the real power belonged to the viziers, who destroyed each other in the struggle for the treasury. In 1163, one such vizier, Shawar, lost and was expelled from Cairo. Where did he flee? The fugitive appeared right in Damascus. Shawar threw himself at Nur ad-Din's feet with a devilish offer. "Restore me to the throne of vizier, and I will pay you 1/3 of Egypt's revenue annually." Nur ad-Din faced a difficult choice. On one hand, a chance to gain control over the untold riches of Egypt. On the other, getting bogged down in the Egyptian swamp, risking losing his army, and more importantly, provoking Jerusalem. He needed someone who would prove themselves a brilliant commander, a loyal executor, and someone who would not be a pity to lose if everything went wrong. His gaze falls on Shirkuh, and Shirkuh, as a mentor, declares that he will take his nephew with him. The Egyptian Gambit had begun, and the man who did not want to participate was sent to meet his destiny. In Damascus, at the court of Nur ad-Din, the young Saladin did not shine like a star. He grew up a quiet, almost invisible youth, inclined toward religious studies rather than military training. Sources report that he studied theology, loved solitude, and seemed to have inherited absolutely none of the fury of his uncle Shirkuh, nor the imperial ambitions of his patron Nur ad-Din. He seemed like the perfect, smart, dutiful, but not dangerous assistant. But the sovereign noticed what escaped the others. Behind this modesty, he discerned cold calculation and a will of steel. He saw in Saladin not just a soldier, but a politician, a man capable not only of conquering, but of holding. It was Nur ad-Din who promoted Saladin, teaching him not only tactics, but his primary science, managing people through justice and ideology. Saladin, like a sponge, absorbed his teacher's style: asceticism, patronage of scholars, the construction of hospitals and schools. He learned how to turn conquest into liberation. Nur ad-Din literally sculpted his successor, perhaps without realizing it himself. He believed he was creating a loyal deputy, but in reality, he was forging his own replacement. And then came the year 1164, the Egyptian Gambit. The exiled vizier Shawar begs for help. Nur ad-Din makes the decision to send an expedition. As commander, he appoints his most proven and ferocious general, Saladin's uncle, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, and as his aide, his political commissar, he orders Saladin to go. And here, the unthinkable happens. Saladin refuses. He pleads with Nur ad-Din to let him stay in Damascus. He is repulsed by this dirty Egyptian intrigue. He does not want to leave his quiet office and theological disputes for a campaign into unknown lands teeming with enemies. But Nur ad-Din is adamant. He orders it. He sees this not just as a military campaign, but as a baptism by fire for his protege. He literally pushes Saladin out of his comfort zone, into the inferno of high politics. Saladin obeys. He goes to Egypt, hating the campaign. He does not yet know that Nur ad-Din has just sent him to meet his fate. Saladin and his uncle Shirkuh, with Nur ad-Din's army, enter Egypt, immediately becoming entangled in the most confusing war of the 12th century. They, as agreed, return the vizier Shawar to the throne. But Shawar, having regained power, immediately betrays Nur ad-Din, seeing the Syrian army as a noose around his neck. And he repeats the path of Damascus. He calls upon the Crusaders for help and concludes an alliance with the king of Jerusalem, Amalric I. Now Nur ad-Din's army has fallen into a trap. In a foreign land, cut off from Syria, and facing them are the combined forces of Egypt and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The next 5 years turned into a series of desperate battles, sieges, and betrayals. Nur ad-Din in Damascus could only watch with anxiety. He could not help directly, only distract the Crusaders by attacking their northern borders. His Egyptian Gambit, his genius plan, hung by a thread. Everything had to be decided at a single point, in a city where Saladin would finally cease to be his uncle's shadow and show for the first time what he had learned from Nur ad-Din. That city was Alexandria. 5 years of the Egyptian war transformed Saladin into a scholar, into a warrior. He fought in the desert, conducted negotiations with traders, and learned to survive while surrounded. But his true baptism by fire awaited him in 1167 in Alexandria. His uncle, Shirkuh, executing a daring maneuver, captured the city. But almost immediately, the combined army of Egyptians and Crusaders under King Amalric laid siege to them. The situation was desperate. Shirkuh, realizing that if he stayed locked in the city, he would lose the initiative, makes a risky decision. Leaving a garrison in Alexandria, doomed to a long and likely fatal siege, he himself breaks out of the encirclement with the main army to wage war in the open field. Command of the garrison is entrusted to Saladin. The very same Saladin who did not want to go to Egypt now commands the defense of a great city. The young man performs brilliantly. For 3 months, he leads the defense, personally participates in sorties, inspires the garrison, and gives the enemies not a single chance. He holds out so staunchly that King Amalric is forced to enter negotiations. The Crusaders, having suffered heavy losses, agreed to an honorable peace. Both armies, Shirkuhs and Amalekiks leave Egypt. Saladin walks out of Alexandria not as the vanquished, but as a hero. The scholar had died. A commander was born. But the story is not finished yet. In 1168, King Amalric violates the treaty and invades Egypt himself, deciding to seize it for his own. Now the Egyptians, in panic, beg Nur ad-Din for help. In January 1169, Shirkuh and Saladin enter Cairo for the third and final time, this time as saviors. The traitor Shawar is executed. Shirkuh, the hero of this grueling war, becomes the new vizier of Egypt. Nur ad-Din in Damascus rejoices. His gambit worked. His man now holds Egypt in his hands. But just 2 months later, Shirkuh, known for his love of lavish feasts, dies suddenly of indigestion. And 32-year-old Saladin, his quiet nephew, accepts the title of Vizier of Egypt, the ruler of the richest country in the world. Saladin is now the ruler of Egypt. Nur ad-Din in Damascus seemingly fulfilled the dream of a lifetime. He controls both Syria and Egypt. For the first time, the Crusaders are caught in a vice from 2 sides. It is here that the tragedy of teacher and student originates. Saladin, upon becoming vizier, immediately begins to consolidate his power. He distributes lands to his emirs. He creates his own army, loyal personally to him. He behaves not like a deputy, but like a sultan. Nur ad-Din in Damascus watches this with growing suspicion. Exercising his right as suzerain, he orders Saladin to attack the kingdom of Jerusalem jointly with him. Saladin sets out on the campaign, but at the last moment retreats, citing bad weather and internal conspiracies. Nur ad-Din is furious. Realizing that Saladin is playing his own game, he understands the vassal does not wish to weaken Jerusalem, which serves as a convenient buffer between him and his teacher in Syria. A cold war begins. In 1174, Nur ad-Din loses patience. He gathers a massive army. The official target is Jerusalem, but everyone, including Saladin, understands where he is actually aiming. He is not marching on the Franks. He is marching on Cairo to punish his ungrateful student. Saladin is terrified. The young man realizes he cannot withstand the military machine of his teacher, the man who taught him everything. The fate of the Middle East hangs by a thread. 2 of Islam's greatest armies are ready to clash with each other, which would gift the Crusaders another 100 years of life. And at this very moment, when catastrophe is inevitable, fate intervenes. Nur ad-Din's army is assembled. The camp in Damascus hums in anticipation of the march. In Cairo, Saladin, his former student, awaits the invasion with anxiety, realizing that a fratricidal war will destroy their common cause. The fate of the Crusades, the fate of Jerusalem and Egypt, everything was to be decided in this collision. And then, in May 1174, 56-year-old Nur ad-Din, at the peak of his power, suddenly falls ill. The cause is not a wound in battle. It is a paratonsillar abscess, severe quinsy. The doctors are powerless. The illness progresses rapidly. On May 15, 1174, in the citadel of Damascus, the just king, the unifier of Syria and the greatest enemy of the Crusaders, dies. Death was not just the end of a reign, but an explosion that stopped the war. The empire that Nur ad-Din had spent 28 years stitching together with his iron will and reputation immediately disintegrated. His heir, As-Salih Ismail, was only 11 years old. The generals and emirs whom Nur ad-Din had kept on a tight leash immediately flew at each other's throats, trying to tear off a piece of the inheritance. Aleppo broke away from Damascus. Mosul declared independence. The great project of Jihad, was dead. But they forgot about Egypt. When the news of the teacher's death reached Cairo, Saladin, according to testimonies, genuinely wept for him. And then he began to act, using his teacher's lessons to perfection. He ceased being a rebellious vassal, transforming into the only man who possessed real power and, more importantly, legitimacy inherited from Nur ad-Din. He understood that only he could now continue the cause of Jihad. He enters Syria, but not as a conqueror. Proclaiming himself the protector of the air, he declares that he has come to save his teacher's empire from greedy generals. It was a brilliant political move. The baton had been passed. The teacher died, clearing the path for the student, and Saladin, taking this legacy into his hands, began his own path to greatness. Nur ad-Din Zangi died without ever retaking Jerusalem, and without uniting Egypt and Syria into a single empire under his personal scepter. However, the truth is paradoxical. His death was not a collapse, but a transfer of the mission. Nur ad-Din acted as the architect. For 28 years he drew the plans, laid the foundation, fired the bricks, and forged the sword. He created the ideology of Jihad, united Syria, and, against the will of the student himself, transformed Saladin from a theologian into a commander. He created all the conditions for victory. That is why his greatest creation was not the conquest of Damascus, but the creation of Saladin. This truth, that power is not inherited, but conquered, lives on from ancient times to our own day. But this was only the first step. Following him came his student, a man who was his complete opposite, restrained yet rapid. He took the ready-made legacy in his hands and united the two parts of the empire. And it was he who delivered the decisive blow to the Crusaders. His name is Saladin. His story turned into a legend that the world remembers to this day. Subscribe so you don't miss out. Like if you were impressed by the architect's paradox. And comment, do you think Saladin could have achieved greatness without Nur ad-Din? Thank you for being with us. Until next time.